Alright, so here it is, finally, the insane, epic, ultimate, whatever you want to call it. It's the triple radiator build in the NR200. Basically, the most amount of cooling performance that you can kind of cram into the Cooler Master NR200. And I'm just going to say it, this is probably the hardest PC build that I've ever done. I know I say that a lot, but this time I really mean it. Two radiators in this case, side and the bottom, that's pretty straightforward. I mean, we've done similar builds like that in my NKSM1, which most of you are familiar with. But that top radiator, which technically shouldn't be possible to do, it is possible, but it is very hard. Now we'll talk more about that top radiator in just a minute, but first let's take a look at what parts went into this and then see whether a build like this is actually worth doing. So for the GPU, I went with an RTX 3080 Ti, mainly because I haven't liquid cooled this specific card yet, and I was curious to see whether EK's special edition block was compatible with it, and luckily it was. I have to say though, it looks absolutely tiny when packed into the NR200, but that means that we have a lot more room for the tubing and the fittings. Then for the CPU, I went with Intel's 11900K, simply because I wanted to do something a little bit different here compared to the recycled Ryzen 5950X builds that I do pretty much all the time, and I've plugged that into the MSI Z590i Unify motherboard. Then as for the power supply, Corsair's SF750 Platinum was the perfect fit here, especially with those flexible sleeved cables that make cable management a whole lot easier. All of the radiators are from XSPC. We have a slim TX240 at the bottom, another TX240 at the top, and then a big EX280 mounted on the side. Each of these radiators and their fans are the absolute limit of what you can install in the NR200. Pretty much everywhere you look, there's just about no clearance left. And so this build, more than anything, is a bit of an experiment. I just personally wanted to see what would happen if I just crammed as much cooling performance as I possibly could in the NR200, and if that would actually result in, more cooling performance than you would expect. And although this triple radiator setup is insanely cool, I mean, this took so much work and it's insanely cool to talk about, it's not something that I would actually recommend building. So let's start with actually mounting a radiator and set of fans to the top panel in the first place, which surprisingly isn't too difficult. The first thing that you need to do is remove the mesh cover by bending back all of the little tabs that lock it into place, and then you can secure the radiator from the top and the fans from the bottom. After that, the mesh panel can be dropped back over it, and then you can bend back all those little tabs to lock it into place. This specific radiator and fan setup for the top, a TX240 with slim Noctua fans, is actually still 2 to 3 millimeters too tall. To get this to fit, I had to trim the edge of the 8-pin CPU connector, I had to remove the clips from the memory DIMMs, and I also had to unscrew the power supply a little bit so that it would sit about 2 millimeters lower. So clearly the struggle was very real to get that top radiator in there, and I'd highly recommend not attempting to do the same thing. Now there is one part that I haven't talked about yet, but is pretty crucial for this build, and that's the low-profile CPU pump block called the Nuvolo Aquanaut. Even when paired with a DDC pump and a pair of full-size fittings, it's still very low profile, not much bigger than your average CPU block, and that gives us plenty of room for the other bunch of hardware that we need to cram into this case. I can't though really comment on the thermal performance here because I haven't had a chance to compare it to anything else, but so far it's keeping the 11900K well under control. Compared to the Barrow pump block though, which I've previously reviewed, I think I would still recommend that one overall, just because that one has a mini reservoir built in too, and so bleeding all of the little air bubbles out of the pump is going to be a lot easier. Even after spending a few hours bleeding out the air of this pump block, there is still a bit of air trapped in there. Part of that is due to the complexity of the loop, but also due to the design of the pump block and not having a reservoir built in. So with this monster triple rad setup, what kind of crazy thermal performance can you expect? Well, it's pretty damn solid, but not anything unrealistic. With all of the fans set to just 1100 RPM, the RTX 3080 Ti settles into around 57 degrees C after a 4K Heaven 4.0 loop for about 40 minutes, and that's running at full power and boost clocks too. For some context, that's about 5 degrees cooler than the liquid cooled 3090 in my NKSM1 under the same conditions. So no doubt, really cool performance here. I mean, this build can basically handle anything at this point, but I also think that you'd be able to achieve pretty similar results just by replacing the top radiator setup with a pair of full-sized fans. And then in terms of build noise, it's pretty quiet. Here's an idea of what it sounded like at full load. If I had to do this build again, I'd probably go for the Barrow CPU pump lock combo instead of the Aquanaut from Nuvolo, although this one is a lot more low profile. I think the Barrow would have made filling up the loop a lot easier. I would though probably stick with the same pump that we're using here, which is the EK-DDC Elite, as I'm pretty surprised with how quiet this actually is, and it can spin as low as 1250 RPM when at idle. I'd also definitely try and find some slimmer fans for that top radiator setup so that clearance isn't an issue. These slim Noctua fans come in at 15mm, but something just a couple millimeters slimmer would have been perfect. Even with the mods that I needed to do here, the top panel still doesn't want to close 100%. Otherwise, I definitely don't want to dull down how cool this PC is and what it's capable of. I mean, 3 radiators inside a case this small is pretty crazy, but realistically, it's probably not a whole lot better than a 2 rad setup, and this is way harder to build. I mean, this is right up there as the hardest PC build that I've ever done. The fitment on all of the parts is absolutely brutal, and I almost threw in the towel multiple times. If you really want to do something similar, again, 2 rads is definitely the way to go, one on the side and one on the bottom, and then go for a pair of full-size fans at the top instead. And again, the purpose of this build was to kind of deliberately close as much clearance between all of the components as possible, and just to see what happens when you cram as much radiator volume and as many fans as you can, and see, you know, whether that actually results in more performance. And I think the results here are pretty good overall. Again, this system can handle pretty much anything you throw at it, but they do not meet the expectations of what you would expect from a triple rad setup. I think this does actually prove that just cramming more radiators and pressing them up against each other does not actually result in more cooling performance. I think what's more important would be like a clean and efficient airflow path, as I've demonstrated in a couple other builds, and those are way easier to build. Now, if you are interested in taking a look at what parts went into this, I will leave them linked down below in the description. As always, a huge thanks for watching, and I will see you all in the next one.